Good morning, everyone. Another beautiful day in paradise on the Seaborn Quest. I don't know if you've noticed, perhaps you have, it's getting a little warmer outside. I think we're getting closer to the Amazon. Well, thank you for coming today. Just a little bit of background. By the way, those of you who walked in a little late, all of those slides were of Recife, our port tomorrow. And just a reminder, you might want to look at going to Olinda, which is right next door to Recife. That was the capital of the Dutch protectorate when the Dutch were in this part of Brazil. Very beautiful UNESCO historic area. Today we're going to be having a somewhat different kind of presentation. My first three presentations, Unique Brazil, the Spanish-American Wars of Independence, and then the Natural Wonders of South America yesterday, were all very destination related. This one and the next couple aren't nearly as destination related. I'll be getting back to destination specific ones a little bit later. I think I'm giving something like 12 or more presentations. So, but these next three are related, and basically, as I was looking at them as a group, I was thinking the main focus here is helping us to better understand the world that we live in today based on everything that happened up until today. And so consequently, I will be covering the history of the world in 45 minutes. So please don't go to sleep, because you're going to miss about three millennia if you do. So let's go ahead and get started. This first presentation focuses on how the European nations came to dominate the world. And I think that this picture right here gives you a pretty good sense of that dominance. All of the bright green countries colonized, well, first of all, Europe. By the way, Europe includes current-day Russia, okay? The European nations we're familiar with, and Russia as well. We'll call it Europe or Eurasia. But the bright green countries are ones that were either colonized or controlled by European nations. The sort of, turquoise kind of countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey and China, partial control or influence. And then there are a few countries in yellow where the European nations had a sphere of influence. And what we're looking at there is, for example, Iran and Afghanistan, Mongolia, Nepal, and Bhutan. And then there's this last group of countries, the orange ones, that there aren't very many. They're not listed there. Those are the only 4 countries in the world today that were never colonized, never controlled, never under the sphere of influence. Only 4. Liberia, Western Africa, Thailand, Japan, and Korea. So, we're going to talk about how it came to pass that most of the world became dominated by European nations. We're going to find out today, how did a band of 1,400 Spanish soldiers overcome 300,000 Aztec warriors? How 160 Spanish foot soldiers, 62 horsemen, defeat an army of 75,000. How did that happen? Well, of course, we know the conquistadors had certain technological advantages. And, you really can't underestimate the importance of technology, as we can see in Ukraine today, and how they're being as successful as they are with modern technology. But the Spanish had the modern technology of the day. Body armor, steel helmets, swords and lances made of steel. They rode horses that gave them a significant positional advantage in battles. But how is it that they had armor? How is it that they had swords and the Inca did not? Another way of phrasing the question, why did development proceed at such different rates on different continents? This is really an interesting question, and that's really the focus of the presentation today. A fellow by the name of Jared Diamond, whose book we'll be talking about most of today, Guns, Germs, and Steel, says that history followed different courses for different people because of differences among people's environments, not because of biological differences among the people themselves. So the theory of racial superiority is absolute nonsense, according to Diamond. I think most of us will agree with that, but perhaps we have never considered how the environment was the source of the superiority that we'll be talking about. Well, Jared Diamond, professor of geography, he's probably emeritus by now, he's 85, professor emeritus of geography at UCLA, recipient of MacArthur Grant, Genius Grant. He did a lot of field research in New Guinea. And along the way, he was a polymath, somebody who could absolutely excel in a whole lot of different fields. Perhaps some of you have read some of his books. These have been very, very popular. The Third Chimpanzee, Upheaval, Collapse. The World Until Yesterday was written just a couple of years ago, so it's fairly current. But the one that we're going to focus on today was his 1997 Pulitzer Prize winner for general nonfiction, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And I just cherry-picked a quote there, a work of complete and total genius. So let's see if you feel that way after I introduce you to Guns, Germs, and Steel. So while he was doing field research in New Guinea, among the indigenous people of New Guinea, he met this individual, Yali, and Yali asked him this question: why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own? Let me translate that for you. Why did wealth and power become so unevenly distributed in the world? Okay, we're covering the history of the world in 45 minutes, so we're going way back, 200,000 years ago. Now, this is the standard map of migration, and we saw it earlier in this cruise, some of us in one of the other presentations, and it's a simplistic view because obviously a lot of migration was seaborne migration. But according to this, the one thing that I think we can all agree on is that Homo sapiens originated in Africa, Western and Southern Africa, and then spread throughout the world. Initially, our ancestors were hunter-gatherers, spread out all over the place, very small groups, just basically living day to day with what they could either hunt down or forage from the environment that they lived in. And at the end of we're picking it up now at the end of the first ice age. Things started to change really dramatically. These hunter-gatherers became more sedentary because hunted animals were scarcer and scarcer. Many of them had been killed to the point of extinction. The climate had moderated, therefore it was easier to grow things. And our ancestors began to domesticate wild plants. They were looking for certain kinds of plants. They were very observant, close to the land. They were looking for plants that would provide them with nutrition, large seeds with a high germination rate, a short growing season. Those of you who are gardeners know that a short growing season is very valuable because if it's a long growing season, there might be premature frosts that will kill your plants. Also, a late frost at the beginning could destroy your crop. Harvested crops that are easy to store. Clearly, they were looking for things that would tide them over during the periods of time when the various plants would not be bearing fruit. And then finally, plants that were self-fertilizing, hermaphroditic. And there are some examples of them there. So I'm going to check and see if you can identify which plants we eat today are inherited from these undomesticated plants. How about the first one at the top? Anyone have any idea? Any guesses? Carrots, yes, exactly. How about the next one? That's a little harder, I think. Tomatoes? No, not quite. Squash, melons, cucurbits. How about that one in the top? Bananas, yes. And that one at the bottom, one of the very most important foods that we eat today, corn. So our ancestors, our nomadic ancestors, as they were settling down into a more sedentary way of life, domesticated these plants and many more, to the point that these 12 plants constitute 80% of the tonnage of food that we eat today, plant-based food. All of those were wild plants at one point in their evolution. Now here's an interesting statement. Try this out. Try and wrap your head around this. Our failure to domesticate even a single major new food plant in modern times suggests that ancient people really may have explored virtually all useful wild plants and domesticated all the ones worth domesticating. I don't know if you agree with that. And there may be some things I say today that you're saying, well, maybe not quite. But if you can think of a major food plant that has been domesticated in the last 100 years, come see me afterwards. I'd love to talk with you. Now, as our ancestors domesticated wild plants, they started to domesticate animals as well. Now, let's look at the definition of domestication. This is when we're talking about a whole species of animals that can be bred in captivity. And of course, there's the opportunity to breed different kinds of animals and maybe create new species, live in a state of mutual dependence alongside of humans. That's domestication, but it's important that we distinguish between domestication and taming. Taming is a totally different situation where individual wild animals are trained through a very labor-intensive process to do certain things that we want them to do. And each and every animal has to be trained. So it's very, very labor-intensive. So seals and bears and so forth, just because you trained a bear to lick your face, when that bear has cubs, you'd better not let the cub lick your face unless you've trained that cub to do that. So this is an interesting theory that Jared Diamond came up with, that there are 6 characteristics that are associated with animal species that can be domesticated. Number 1, either herbivore or an omnivore, in other words, an animal that eats both plants and animals, not a carnivore. An animal that's strictly a carnivore cannot be domesticated. And there's an example, a cheetah. Able to breed in captivity. Don't have a nasty disposition. Why did I put up a zebra to illustrate that? Zebras kill and wound more zookeepers in the United States than do all of the wild cats. Apparently, they're very nasty temperament. Number 4, a rapid growth rate. So elephants are not domesticated, they are trained. And don't have a tendency to panic in pens and around humans. That's called a guanaco. It's a close relative of the alpaca, of the llama, but they cannot be tamed the way alpacas and llamas can. And then finally, number 6, this is interesting. They can live in herds, domesticated. This species can live in herds with well-developed dominance hierarchy and are non-territorial. How many of you have a cat that you love dearly? Okay. There are certain exceptions to this rule. Cats and ferrets are the only exceptions to this rule, according to Jared Diamond. So Cats are apparently very territorial, I assume. And each cat is its own master or mistress, as the case may be. So, domestication of animals proceeded along with the domestication of plant species. And let's reflect for a moment on how beneficial that is to us today. Source of protein, obviously. We'll see that protein at lunch and dinner today. Source of milk and milk products. The clothing that we wear is sometimes made from the hide of different animals or the fur, such as the sheep there. Means of transportation, very, very important. Horses, for example. And military superiority. It wasn't until the First World War was the first major war where cavalry was irrelevant. Up until that point in time, all of the wars were significantly decided by the cavalry, people on horses. And of course, they can pull plows and provide valuable fertilizer and so forth. So the domestication of animals was a major step forward in the ability of our ancestors to survive. And I've got a list of 14 here. Large mammals, let me define large, 100 pounds or more. And these, in the order in which they were domesticated, were all of the animals that were domesticated in Eurasia. Take a moment to look at it. 8 BCE for sheep, they were the first, along with the goats and pigs, and cows and donkeys and so forth, in chronological order. Take a look at the right-hand side. Where was this happening? Where was the domestication taking place? Well, as you look at this chart, the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 locations were the Fertile Crescent. And that's what I'm going to talk about now, the Fertile Crescent. And as you can see, the greened area is almost like a crescent. It includes the Nile Valley and the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates, and across the end of the Mediterranean. The Fertile Crescent has been called the cradle of civilization for good reason, because that was the first place where plants were domesticated. That was the first place that these large animals were domesticated, where use of copper and bronze tools and iron tools started there before the other locations that are indicated in that chart. So really, our focus now is going to be on what was going on there that made that such the beginning of the world that we live in today. Let's look at agriculture, first of all, these domesticated plants. That particular area, long hot summers, mild wet winters, which was very, very good for growing a whole variety of crops. Extreme weather apparently was not part of the equation then. And at that point in time, perhaps not so much now, after all of these centuries, at that point in time, that whole land was very fertile. Of course, there are river systems that are associated with those parts of the world. And so it was a very, very good place to start growing domesticated plants. In addition, there's a lot of elevation change throughout the Fertile Crescent. And elevation change has at least a couple of benefits associated with it. You can grow harvests at different points of time in the year. And you can grow different kinds of plants at different elevations. So that was a very important factor. And last but not least, the ancestors of these plants that we value so much today, they lived there. They were there in abundance. The wild ancestors of wheat, barley, flax, chickpeas, peas, lentils, some of the most important grains, the wild plants were growing in the Fertile Crescent, ready to be domesticated. Now, these early people were innovative. They were able to take these natural advantages I've been talking about and create implements that would enable them to leverage all of those benefits. Sickles, baskets, mortars and pestles for grinding, removing the husks of various grains. They developed a technique for drying grains so that the grains could be stored without sprouting. They developed waterproof underground storage pits. So they were in the forefront of agricultural innovation. Okay, so let's get back to the question. What does all of this have to do with how the European countries became dominant? That's the key question that we're going to continue to follow today. Let's look at this map for a minute. This is Jared Diamond's answer to that question. Okay, we're talking about the Fertile Crescent, which is probably right at the eastern end of the Mediterranean that you can see in the picture. Now, one thing that I think is indisputable is that countries and lands that are on the same latitude share same day length, seasonal variation, ranges in temperature and rainfall. And as a result, let's say France and Japan share similar, they're on the same latitude, share these similar characteristics. Why is that important? Because these characteristics determine how plants grow, when they should be planted, when they germinate, when they are ready for harvest, and so forth. And so along the same latitude, plants that will grow at one end of a 4,000-mile length can be grown at the other end. Whereas if you go north-south for even 1,000 miles, you have too much variation to migrate plants north or south. They can go east and west very easily. I hope I explain that so that you can understand that. That makes a lot of sense to me. So the plants that were developed, domesticated in the Fertile Crescent, moved east, they moved west very easily, not north-south. And to prove this point, these different squares and dots and various symbols that you see there are locations where they have been able to verify through various scientific techniques, carbon dating, the gradual spread over thousands of years from the east to the west. So the first circle, 7,000 BC, and then 6, and then 5,000, and then 3,800, and 2,500, and so forth. Gradually, they are able to prove that those domesticated plants originating in the Fertile Crescent spread to the west and to the northwest. And at the same time that those plants were migrating, so to speak, domesticated animals were coming right along with them, along that same path. Okay, so I hope you're with me so far. But why is it that European nations became more powerful than Asian nations? Didn't you say just a few minutes ago, same latitude, same benefits of plants and animals that could survive and thrive at the same latitude? Why is it that the European nations became so dominant rather than China, for example, or Japan? Well, and this is a sort of a, think about this. This is an interesting explanation that Diamond came up with. The topography, the geography of the European nations, it's very broken up. There were a lot of small nation states that were created because of the various mountain ranges, the Pyrenees, the Apennines, the Alps, the Balkans, the various rivers, the Rhine, the Loire, the Rhone, divided up that part of the world into very distinct, somewhat isolated from each other, geographic regions where different people congregated together. And by having so many neighbors around them, there was a perceived external threat to their existence, and they adopted innovations very quickly, perhaps more quickly than did, for example, the Chinese, where there were no, really a lack of natural barriers. The result of that was really huge empires contrasted to what was going on in Europe, and no external pressures to innovate. I'm still working on buying into that theory, but it makes enough sense for me to consider that that's a pretty good explanation to answer the question, why did European nations become more powerful than Asian nations? Well, as plants and animals were domesticated, food surpluses started to become a reality. For the first time in the history of the world, people had enough food, more than enough food. And as a result, not everybody had to work the land. Whereas in the past, everyone had to be out there growing plants and raising animals, it was possible to form cities where people could then develop specializations because they were fed by the people on the land raising plants and animals. So for the first time, we see priests and record keepers and metal workers and artisans. And just to give you an example of the kind of innovation that all of these specializations encouraged, the evolution of metal objects. Start off very simplistically, dig the metal out of the ground if it's soft enough to hammer it into shapes. And then the furnaces that they used for pottery were then used to develop bronze objects, and then higher temperature furnaces later, smelting of iron objects. And just 2 days ago, I came across this news article. Steel was already being used in Europe 2,900 years ago, a study that was just published 2 days ago. So again, there was an opportunity to innovate, to develop new technology that had never existed before because there was a surplus of food that enabled the rise of different specialties. And let's take a look at one specific example here. Well, first of all, the process of innovation feeds on itself. Innovations lead to innovations, and faster and faster and faster. And we've seen that with technology in our lifetime. It's called autocatalysis. As one innovation leads to another in more rapidly increasing cycles. So here we have a picture of the Gutenberg Bible. This particular picture is, this Bible is in the Library of Congress, if you're ever there in Washington, D.C. It's one of something like only 4 or 5 of this particular beautiful intact version of the Gutenberg Bible. How was Gutenberg able to develop a printing press? Well, used advances in technology and movable type from China. Developments in metals enabled the development of steel and letter punches, lead for molds. Wine and olive screw presses were used in the printing press. Gutenberg developed typecasting from metal dies. And so all of these innovations came together to create the opportunity to print books for the first time. And of course, that was one of the major turning points in the history of the world. Now, as all of these things were happening, society was evolving, as you might imagine. Look at the across the top there, band, tribe, bands of dozens, tribe hundreds, chiefdom thousands, states over 50,000. And there are a whole lot of different characteristics associated with those different levels of society. But over a period of time in Europe, because of all the things we've been talking about, there became a fairly significant concentration of states there prior to elsewhere in the world. Because in 1500, less than 20% of the world's land area was organized into states run by the governments. But it was in Europe where many of those states did exist as far back as 1500. And states could wage sustained wars of conquest. I think you're seeing where we're finally coming around to how it was that the European nations were able to dominate the world. Now, we've talked about, Diamond's book is called Guns, Germs and Steel. We pretty much talked about guns and we've talked about steel. But we haven't talked about germs yet and the role that germs played, and that's what we're going to talk about now. Diseases in the New World. 1492, Columbus discovered the New World. 100, and this is, I don't know how they came up with this estimate. Who knows? But it has been estimated that 100 million people lived in the New World, and more than 80% of them were dead. Of course, all of them were dead by the time, within 2 centuries. Let's rephrase that. I just realized how ridiculous that statement is. Let's rephrase that to say the population declined more than 80% in 2 centuries, okay? And the reason being for that decline, for that really Holocaust kind of experience that they had, the decimation of the original inhabitants, was diseases. But, okay, that doesn't really answer the question. How is it that the Spanish conquistadors weren't killed off by the diseases? Why was it the indigenous people rather than the conquistadors? Why did diseases brought by the European invaders decimate indigenous people? Okay, I think I'm going to open your eyes with this one. According to Jared Diamond, European societies acquired I love his way with words, a much richer collection of dangerous pathogens to which the European people had acquired immunity than was the case for Native Americans. Okay, why had they acquired such a wonderful collection of dangerous pathogens? Interesting way of describing it. It gets back to the origin of diseases. They are deadly gifts from our animal friends. There are over 300 diseases in the world today that originated from animals. Some domesticated and some not. Think of Ebola virus, swine flu, bird flu, possibly COVID. Look at these, the origin, the animal source of these diseases. Cattle, pigs and ducks, pigs and dogs, birds, and so forth. Isn't that amazing? Okay, well, let's ask ourselves the question, where were people living in large villages and cities in close relationship with domesticated animals? I think you know the answer. Europe. And so just sort of in summary here, this is the way epidemic diseases are transmitted. Animals infect humans, humans infect humans, humans die or develop immunity, and so on and so forth over a long period of time. So all of those conquistadors came across to the New World with all kinds of immune systems that were just really immune to the diseases that they were bringing with them as they brought their animals along with them. So here we are back to the question that we began with at the very beginning. Yali, why is it that you white people developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had little cargo of our own? So this is a summary. Access in Eurasia to plants and animals that could be domesticated. That, way back to the Fertile Crescent I was talking about. And then the transition to hunting-gathering societies, from hunter-gathering societies to agrarian societies, which created food surpluses, which encouraged population growth. Society evolved, ruling classes and bureaucracies came into existence. Nation states, consequently, were organized. And food surpluses also encouraged the development of specialization, non-farming activities, which led to technological innovations, which developed guns and steel. And the Europeans brought along their animals, brought along their germs to wherever they went to, not just here in Central and South America and the Western Hemisphere, but all over the world. And these nation states had armies that then led to the domination of the world by the European nations. So that concludes my talk today, and I think we've got a few minutes for questions. So if anyone has any questions, I'd love to see if I can answer them. Anyone have any questions? I'm sorry, I'm hitting a cold with this. Yes, Bill. Okay, Bill's question was it just these diseases that enabled the victories of Cortez and in Mexico, the Aztecs, and Pizarro, the Inca, in Peru? And that was a big part of the reason, Bill. And in fact, 3 presentations from now, I will be sharing with you Inca, the children of the sun. And I will describe in detail how Pizarro was able, with a very small group of people, to conquer the Inca Empire. And a lot of it was perfect timing. Smallpox had made its appearance, and people were dying very, very quickly. So that was a large part of it, Bill. There was a lot more to it, which I'll get into with the Inca. Maybe later on I'll have a chance to give you my Aztec lecture. I'm not sure I'll have time for that. But the bottom line was that set the stage, that set the environment where this small group of bloodthirsty, greedy conquistadors were able to be so successful. Yes, sir?
I've read that when Cortez arrived on the scene, that the Aztecs initially sort of fell down and worshipped him. Would you like to explain that?
Okay, yeah. Probably I won't get to the Aztec lecture. The question is, did the Aztecs fall down and worship Cortez when he arrived? And was that part of the answer to the question? I think that's been pretty much discredited. There was a Quetzalcoatl, the white god who had departed to the east, who would return one day, white skin, beard, and there was a little bit of confusion at first, but I think Montezuma and his followers realized pretty quickly that this scruffy band of dirty, bloodthirsty men were not gods. But I think it might have taken a little bit of time to come to that realization. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
You pointed out that China is approximately the same latitude with its developments, and we all know China has, is credited with so many technological advancements and discoveries. Why is it that we really haven't seen any evidence of Chinese explorers?
You haven't because you haven't read enough. I'm sorry, Dave, he's my friend, so I can. No, I meant no insult there, Dave. Yeah, they did a lot of exploring. And in fact, there was a Chinese admiral by the name of Zheng He who had the largest fleet in the history of the ancient world, sailed as far as Saudi Arabia and Madagascar and everywhere in between. And for a while, some people thought he might have even sailed across the Pacific to the Western Hemisphere, but I think that's discredited now. But the bottom line is, the dynasty that Ming Dynasty, I'm not sure, I get those dynasties mixed up. The dynasty that he was working, that he was a part of, he was part of the royal court, a eunuch, by the way. The empire was being attacked from the north and west by the Mongol hordes, and the dynasty decided it would not look outward to expand its frontier through exploration, so they closed in. All of Zheng He's ships were burned, destroyed, became a capital crime to sail on the open ocean. Their whole focus was on surviving the invasion from the north. So they could have easily been the major focus of my presentation on the next Sea Day, I think 3 days from now. They could easily have become part of this presentation on the age of exploration, but they did not for the reason that I indicated. And so if you haven't read about them, it's because it was a period of exploration that was cut short by the Emperor of China. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I haven't read any of Diamond's books, at least I don't remember
Okay.
reading them.
Mm-hmm.
How does it account for the fact that in the Americas and in Africa you have some of the same growing conditions that you would have had in the Fertile Crescent, and yet you don't have any of that developed,
Okay.
and you have the same resources?
Okay. There was no land mass connecting to the northern hemisphere. So there was no way to move across land from, say, Europe to the Far East, as, you know, it was separated by an ocean. But the environment where these domesticated plants and animals would not just survive but flourish, there is such an environment in the northern and southern hemispheres. And we'll talk about that when I talk about the Columbian Exchange, which is the exchange of plants and animals that took place after Columbus came to the New World. But the ocean stopped that from, those animals and plants from being introduced until much later in time. Did that answer your question?
No, because some of the plants that you have on your list come from the Americas and from Africa. They don't come from the Fertile Crescent.
Okay, well, I think we need to talk about that because I'm not so sure about that. But I will be talking in the Columbian Exchange how specific animals and plants were exchanged between the old world and the new. Any other questions? Yes?
This is probably not an appropriate question for here, but if humans developed in Africa and then migrated up, why did it happen in Africa and not in other areas of the world where there was similar environment?
Okay, I have not read very much about the origin of Homo sapiens, so I'm honestly, the question was why did it happen in Africa rather than elsewhere? I don't know.
I never thought about it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I don't know why those three different Homo-related species why was Africa the origin place of those three different species? I don't know, honestly, I'm sorry. Does anyone know? No? That's where the apes were. Okay, all right. That's where the apes were. I love that answer. Okay, all right. Yes, Doug. Yeah.
What about the possibility that with population growth in the areas you talked about, there was scarcity of land, and so there was possibly a need to acquire or to look for additional land and to develop the means of acquiring that additional land, which would include perhaps steel, elements.
Okay. Yeah, the question/comment was, there was over a period of time, Europe had gone through a lot of its natural resources. The ground agricultural lands had become less fertile, and so forth. And part of the motivation for exploring the world and finding new places to conquer, create colonies, was a result of their recognition that, hey, there are many more resources elsewhere. They're quite limited and depleted in some respects in Europe. So, folks, I think we probably should call it a day here right now, but see you in about 3 days, and we'll be talking about the age of exploration. Thanks for coming.